Hey guys, welcome to Capturing Christianity. I'm here tonight with Dr. Tim McGrew. If you don't know what we do, we're a channel dedicated to exposing the intellectual side of Christian belief. And so today we're asking, do extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence? This is a claim that you hear a lot from atheists. And it's more of like a slogan, I guess, if you want to call it. It's almost like a showstopper is one way that Tim put it in a lecture I was watching. They say something like, well, a man coming back from the dead is extraordinary, and so you've got to give me extraordinary evidence, basically, if you want me to believe it. And so my guest, Dr. Timothy McGrew, if you don't know who he is, he's a professor and chairman of the Department of Philosophy at Western Michigan University. He's a specialist in theory of knowledge, logic, probability theory, and the history of and philosophy of science. Dr. McGrew has spoken at Oxford, MIT, and other universities, as well as at many churches and seminaries across the United States and overseas. He has also engaged in public debates on the meaning of faith, the rationality of belief in miracles, and the historical reliability of the Gospels. He's also just an all-around awesome guy, like probability guy, Bayesianism. He's extremely intelligent. So it's awesome to have you on, Tim. You've been on before on the podcast, right? When we were discussing street epistemology.
Right, but not on the webcast. So this is now we're up with a video, and this is a brave new world.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Live is there's no mistakes now. On the podcast, we could fumble over our words, but today we're just all the mistakes are going to be in there. So, well, let's jump into the interview. Tim, take about 60 seconds and add on to anything that I didn't cover. What do you do? What are you doing? Who you are? Why you're interested in apologetics? All the good stuff.
You forgot to mention that I make awesome paper airplanes and that I'm a chess master who has a daughter who beat me the last time we played in a tournament game. So this is a lot of fun. Chess is big in our house. So
what's that like, getting beat by your daughter?
It's amazing. I took her out to eat to celebrate. I mean, can you imagine? You're a master and then your daughter beats you. You're like, yes! It's so amazing. It's awesome. She is the Michigan women's champion for the second year in a row.
Congratulations. I got to let her know.
Yep. All right. So what got me into apologetics was, I think, what gets a lot of people into apologetics. I went through a period of time when I was in high school and the first year or two of college when I really wanted to know, okay, this is what good people around me believe, but is it true? And so I began studying the question, reading the Atheist Debater's Handbook and Atheism, the Case Against God, and reading some of Gary Habermas's work, which had just come out. The Habermas flu debate had just come out when I began being interested in this, the very first Habermas flu debate. And so I started reading these things and looking for answers and developing my own questions and trying to sort it all out. And that was sort of phase one. And at the end of phase one, I was excited about getting things right. And so I decided I would do a PhD in philosophy if I could and try to get into this skepticism thing all the way down to the ground and figure out where it's going. Phase two started about 10 or 11 years ago. I guess it's more like 12 years ago now. Gosh, I'm getting old. I was researching for the article that I was going to write with Lydia for the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology, the article on the resurrection. And that research revealed to me a whole new world of resources. Google Books was just getting started at that time. The Internet Archive was going up, and suddenly I had access to books that I had never dreamed existed. And so learning that literature has been an adventure all in its own right, and I've done a digital humanities project at Oxford on that as well.
Yeah, I was going to say, you've spent a lot of time thinking about miracles and developing a particular view about them. So what in your mind is like the best definition of a miracle?
I think there's a couple of ways you can approach this, but I think the best definition would be a miracle is something that would not have happened if there had not been something outside of the natural order interfering with the natural order. And by the natural order, I mean the world of physical things, including human beings and creatures much like ourselves. So, if there are Klingons out there, they would count as part of the natural order. God is not just a part of the natural order. And if God intervenes within the physical system, then the physical system is not a closed system. Something from the outside is making things happen in it. And that, I think, is the best way to think about them. That's different from a very famous definition that David Hume gives, but I think his definition is problematic. We can maybe talk about that if some of your guests want to discuss that.
Yeah, I'm thinking about it's almost like your definition is sort of counterfactual.
Right. It would not have happened unless something from outside had intervened. Hume likes to speak in terms of violations of the laws of nature. I think that's not a great way to think of it. I think violations of the causal closure of the physical world, that's a good way to think about it. But he does have this additional bit that he tags on sometimes and not other times, where he says, by the particular interposition of a deity. So that bit, I think he's on the right track with. We're talking about a supernatural agent intervening in the natural order. And the way that we can tell that somebody's monkeying with it from the outside is that things are happening that wouldn't happen unless somebody was monkeying with it. Think of John 3, right? Nicodemus comes to Jesus by night and he says, Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher sent from God, because no one can do these signs that you are doing unless God is with him. Okay, they wouldn't be happening unless God were with you. Got it. Nicodemus is picking up on something there. I think he's got the right basic idea. Things are happening that can't be explained if God's not with this guy, so we better figure out what's going on.
Interesting. My mind is going all over the place with that one. Well, let's talk about the history of this claim: extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Was that Carl Sagan that originally came up with this?
Sagan made it popular in that form, but the challenge couched in the language of extraordinary claims had been going around at least since the 19th century, because some 19th century authors like John Kennedy actually responded and discussed that and took that up. So, and some of the same ambiguities, I think, were present at the time that it was originally brought up, as are below the surface in Sagan's own version of it. So there's some interesting stuff going on there.
All right. So sometimes this is a response that I've seen from my fellow Christians, theists. Sometimes they'll respond to this phrase, this slogan, by sort of applying it to itself. Like the phrase extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence is an extraordinary claim, but no extraordinary evidence exists in defense of it. So it kind of undermines itself. What are your thoughts on that type of response to this slogan?
Sometimes that kind of judo works. Here, I think whether it works is going to depend on what's meant by extraordinary. If you simply mean evidence capable of moving us rationally from evaluating something as improbable to evaluating it as probable, then I'm going to grant the claim. I'm going to say, you know what? On that interpretation, that's good. That's fair. If you mean something else by extraordinary, then we're going to have a conversation about what you mean. And by the time that we're done with that conversation, I'm going to hope to have moved you back towards the probabilistic definition, because if I haven't, then maybe something like that self-application problem would be legitimate.
So maybe this is a good time to actually move to your slides that you have prepared, because you actually have something that's sort of relevant here.
So let me see if I can bring these up. This worked once. Will it work again? This is always the wonderful question. But, I believe in induction. It's part of my job. So let's see if this works. Tell me if you can see the Argumentum Sagani.
It is there.
It is there. So this is a whimsical reconstruction. I am not the person who was first responsible for this, but I've tweaked it in a few ways. And so I'll lay claim just to this version of this, but some wag on the internet originally put out a version of this. So sometimes I think when I hear this slogan, I try to talk with people about it, and it comes to something like this. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The claim that a miracle has occurred is extraordinary. Therefore, any evidence supporting it ought to be extraordinary as well. I'm not sure what I mean by extraordinary, but whatever you come up with, it's not going to work. Therefore, it is unreasonable to believe that a miracle has occurred. That's tongue-in-cheek, but actually within the past 24 hours, I've been involved in discussions where it really does seem that this is where people are going with it. This is what they mean by it. And they don't see anything wrong with this argument. They don't even feel a twinge of conscience when they come to premise 4. So I think we have to do better if we're going to try to unpack the slogan. And so that's where I would would go. So the first question, what does this word extraordinary mean? It can't just mean unprecedented, because every event is unprecedented if you define it in sufficient detail. My having a live video webinar with Cam on a Thursday night in May about the question of whether extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence is a thing that has never happened before. And you can say, well, but webinars happen. That happens, right? But I can define the resurrection in terms general enough to make it a member of a class of things that always happen. An event is brought about by a power adequate to produce the effect. There, that's happened lots of times, and that's what the resurrection was. That's not really helpful either way. It really doesn't get us anywhere.
Yeah, so if I can just jump in here. So this is something that I picked up on. We were talking about this right before we went live. Are you describing here like the reference class problem for?
Yeah, that is a kind of a reference class issue, and the trouble is that it's often just assumed without argument. Well, we can just do that, and we'll have that. The reference class problem will just scotch any discussion of miracles. That's just not true, actually, because every event can be placed in multiple reference classes, and this is a problem that we work on in statistics as well. So here's, I think, a better try. An extraordinary event is an event that belongs to a natural type or kinds of events that are intrinsically rare, such as miracles.
And so here it seems like you're trying to be charitable, right? So the person
Right.
who's saying this claim.
Yeah, I'm trying to give it a better shot. Sometimes the best thing to do when you're confronted with an argument that just doesn't seem very good is to steel man it, to try to produce a version of it that's better than the version being presented to you. Because sometimes bad presentations are just inadvertent. Somebody's just not very good at presenting their own case. Sometimes those weak presentations really are just weak, but there's a better argument somewhere in the vicinity, and you really ought to engage with the best that you can find. So I'm going to try at various points to present these things, improve them, and then critique them. So how do you get from an event is rare to an event is improbable? Because rare events occur. We all know this. If all that we know is that it's a rare event, then the claim that it has occurred at such and such a time in such and such a place might be improbable before we consider the evidence for it. But once we consider the evidence for it, that can change. So this is a distinction that philosophers and mathematicians discuss with the terminology of prior and posterior probabilities. The probability that something has independent of our looking at the specific evidence, and the probability that it has once we've taken specific evidence into account.
So let's talk about a sort of mundane example of this. Maybe we can talk about like a lottery.
Sure, right. I've never won a lottery. If I were to send you an excited message on Facebook saying, guess what, Cam, I won a lottery. For one thing, you'd probably say, where is Tim and what have you done with his body? But in any event, you would not dismiss the testimony on the grounds that that's something that's never happened before. Even you're knowing a lottery winner, probably you know thousands of people, and you may not even know any lottery winners, right? So it's rare, but it happens. And if you were to ask yourself the question, okay, before I have any evidence regarding the question, what do I think the probability is that Tim wins the lottery this, next Powerball or something? The answer would be, well, that's really, really, really improbable. But it would not take an overwhelming amount of testimony to persuade you that nevertheless, this very, very improbable thing has happened. Some people don't like the lottery example. They say, yeah, but that's not a miracle.
Well, they also say, well, we know that people win the lottery all the time.
Right. We know that people win it, but we're talking about my winning it. Okay. And that's the event that we said was improbable. Right. Nobody thinks that it requires massive amounts of evidence to establish somebody somewhere won some lottery. That may even be just a fixed part of what's going on when there is a lottery. Maybe it's guaranteed to have a winner after a certain amount of time, a certain number of tickets are sold or something. But we're talking about a particular event, my winning the lottery. And that's improbable viewed apart from evidence. But the point is, If it's the improbability that's driving the argument, then it's relevant to say, not terribly crazy amounts of testimony change improbabilities to probabilities for us. And we do this all the time. So if the objection to miracles is they're improbable and testimony can't do the job, then we have to ask the parallel question, why is it that it seems to do the job with all kinds of other things? I think that I would have said it's improbable, if you'd asked me, last December, it's improbable that the city of Baltimore will be held hostage by cyber hackers who have encrypted all of their data in the city computers. I would have said, oh, come on, they've probably got a cybersecurity officer whose job it is to take care of that kind of thing. I don't think that's very likely at all. Well, lo and behold, right? It doesn't take more than one or two news stories for me to say, all right, then, guess that happened. So this distinction between how probable something is before we consider the evidence, like what would you have predicted? What would you have thought might happen? How likely would you have thought it was? That's one set of questions. The question, all right, now that the evidence is in, what do you think? That's a very different set of questions. And some of the most exciting stuff in epistemology happens in between those, right? The transition from one to the other.
One of the things that you talked about in your lecture that I was listening to earlier was like, when people say extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, I think maybe what they have in mind is that they just need one big piece of extraordinary evidence, when in reality, like when we were actually looking at it from a mathematical standpoint, you don't need one big piece of evidence.
Right. I have that in the slides here somewhere, but I think it's a ways further on. Let's see if we can. I've got other mathy stuff in between. Do you want me to hop straight to that?
No, let's. If you're going to get to it eventually, then yeah, let's just keep chugging along.
Yeah. So here's a little bit of math, and I promise there are only a few bits of this. So for people who are listening who are allergic to mathematics, just have the epinephrine pen handy, and we'll get past the stuff you're allergic to. Here's a way of trying to talk about miracles and testimony. And it reads like this. I'll read it out verbally, okay? The probability that a miracle has occurred, given that we've got some testimony to it, is greater than not. Only if the probability that a miracle has occurred, however low that may be, is greater than the probability that we'd have the testimony we do if the miracle hadn't occurred. So this is an approximation. This is not a consequence of Bayes' theorem, but it's an approximation that we get if we set the probability that a miracle hasn't occurred very, very close to 1. And, well, I think I've got this right here. If we set the probability of the testimony, given that the miracle occurred close to 1, and we set the probability the miracle hasn't occurred close to 1, then this drops out as an excellent approximation, and it makes sense of some of Hume's own language. So basically, we're saying, all right, what's more likely or more unlikely, that a miracle has occurred, or that people should falsely give the kind of testimony that in fact we have? Now, that's not the same thing as saying, which is the way it is often put across by skeptics, what's more probable, that a miracle should occur or that people should lie or be mistaken? Well, in general, yeah, people lie and are mistaken. But what if I did this about the lottery? What's more probable, that I won, that I didn't win the lottery, or that people lied or were mistaken? People lie about various things under various circumstances, and they're mistaken in various cases all the time. But the question is, are they lying and mistaken here about this? And so this inequality can help us to look at what's going on here and say, all right, well, we've got some kind of grip on it, but it can't solve the issue for us. It's not going to resolve the question of whether a miracle has occurred. It can focus the discussion, but it can't be used as a slogan for just settling the debate. Probability theory is math. Math cannot settle empirical questions. And so that's the sort of the immediate take-home message there. By the way, if anybody wants them, I'll send you all these slides, and you can send them out to anybody who wants them. So they're there. They're free for anybody who wants to have a look at them.
Yeah, if you want to give me a link to that after this, then I can just put it in the description of the video so people can just click on it.
Sure, will do. Or I'll send you the slides and you can link them up. So now here's a Bayesian style. Bayes' theorem is a piece of probability. It's a piece of math. Bayesian approaches to probability are approaches to probability that use that bit of math to try to reconstruct our inferences. So here's a way of putting it. E is strong evidence for H under exactly this condition, that IFF means if and only if. So if and only if, and to the extent that we would expect E, if H were true, much more strongly than we would expect it if H were false. Which is equivalent to saying if you took the ratio of those two probabilities, it would be a lot greater than 1. It would be top heavy. The top of the fraction would be a lot larger than the bottom part of the fraction. So that's just really comparing our expectations if it were true and if it were false. There's a lot of fun detail work that we could get into there, but I'm trying to breeze through the mathy parts so that I don't lose all of your audience. So if we end up just talking to each other alone at the end here, Cameron, it's your fault. I'll just blame you. That's my story and I'm sticking to it. Yeah.
Well, let me jump in and just remind people that if this is like too much for you, then just go back and watch it again, I suppose. That's one thing.
You could use the old med school advice for people who are trying to pass math and physics: hum the equations and then catch up with us after that. All right. So I give the strict version on this slide. Who wants that? Okay. But even if we take this claim, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, there's still a problem that we have to deal with, which is that it can make it sound like there's supposed to be one single spectacular piece of evidence. Occasionally we get spectacular evidence for things, but usually we change our minds about things like, say, novel scientific theories because there's a gradual accumulation of a bunch of pieces of evidence. It certainly was that way with the Copernican revolution, where Copernicus' view that the Earth is orbiting the sun rather than vice versa gradually came to be accepted as various problems were solved, as Galileo's telescopic observations came in and so forth, and ultimately in the Newtonian synthesis. Occasionally, as with Einstein's theory of general relativity, you get one really big splashy piece of evidence, but there were already smaller pieces of evidence with that too. So this is something that we want to be alive to, is that a lot of our reasoning is cumulative. We accumulate a bunch of pieces of evidence and they all point in the same direction. So here's a Bayesian style version of this, okay? The probability of a bunch of pieces of evidence number 1 and number 2 and so on, supposing that H were true, divided by the probability of all those pieces of evidence, supposing H were false, is much greater than 1. The fraction's very top heavy. So now all we have to do is assign probabilities to those conjunctions. Yeah, but we're actually not very good at that because we don't realize how fast a conjunction like that can send the probability down. This is something I've put a bunch of references in here. You can go read these papers. We actually are prone to estimate wrongly how fast a set of fractions smaller than 1 multiplied by one another gets really small. It gets really small really fast. So here's like a fallacy of composition, which we study in other respects in logic class. This one goes, none of these numbers is very great or small, therefore their product is not very great or very small. Ooh, not true. Not true at all. Actually, just no. Doesn't work. So here's a fun thought experiment, and I'll just put this out as a teaser, and anybody who wants to can work on it. Suppose you've got 2 sacks. You can't tell them apart from the outside. Maybe they're book bags and they're bought from the same store and they're the same color. One of them has 75 red marbles and 25 green. The other one vice versa. You pick one of the bags, set the other one aside, and you pull a marble out, check its color, throw it back in and mix them up. Pull a marble out, check its color, throw it back in, mix them up. You do this 13 times and you get this little string: green, red, green, red, red, green, red, 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 green, red, red, green. What's the probability given this information, that you've selected the mostly red bag. If you peer at it, there's a kind of a disproportion of reds there. I think there's like 3 more reds than there are greens. But it was 50-50 as to which bag you got at the beginning. How much evidence is that? What should you say about that? Fun problem to chew on. Let people think about that a little bit. So the way to solve this problem is to take apart the evidence, break it up, and that doesn't guarantee that your probability assignments are accurate, but it gets rid of a source of cognitive bias, and that's really the best that we can do under the circumstances, is to try to break it down like that. So here's the upshot, the sort of the end of the matter. Anything that you could in principle do with a single spectacular piece of evidence, you can also do by the accumulation of smaller, less spectacular pieces of evidence. So if somebody's going to say extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and I mean I want one big one, then that's unreasonable. And so there, I think we can definitely cry foul if that's the way this is being pressed. Okay, I've been talking a lot, and I just ran through a whole bunch of math and probably killed off about half the audience. So let me just stop there and let you jump in.
Well, actually, we have more watching now than we did before, so I think we're doing okay.
What is wrong with these people?
They may have come to see Tim McGrew talk about miracles and probability theory. All right, so here's what I wanted to get back to, was the analogy that you gave with the marbles. So how does that play in with like the probability stacking up? Because maybe I missed the explanation of like, so that example,
let's just count here. We've got what, 5 green and 8 red, right? So we've got 3 more red than we had green. So some people think that the probability should be whatever 8 over 13 is, or something like that. But actually, what's happening here is that we're multiplying each time, and it comes out that the probability is about 27 over 28. It's up in the high 90s. Is the probability that we've got the mostly red bag. A few pieces of evidence accumulating, there's some canceling out. Every green one and red one as a pair cancel each other out. But the other pieces each have a multiplier of 3, and 3 times 3 is 9, times 3 is 27. We convert those odds back into a probability by doing 27 over 27 plus 1, so we get 27 over 28, and that's more than 96%. So here's a case where we've got pieces of evidence. No one piece of evidence is all that striking by itself, but the cumulative effect of putting a few pieces of those evidence together, even when there's some mixture back and forth, the preponderance of the evidence carries the day. We use this kind of reasoning without doing the math all the time. We just artlessly look at cases where a bunch of clues point to the same conclusion, and we take it that that conclusion is true. All that this is doing is putting a mathematical cutting edge on that kind of reasoning that we do naturally all the time. This is common sense written with a mathematical pen.
Well, so I just wanted to bring one comment that we've had in the live chat from the Canadian Atheist. He says, I cannot believe he's comparing marbles to a god. If your god was as evident as marbles, we'd be done already. So should we end the live stream?
Oh, wow. My faith is just stricken. Yeah. Okay. This question does not reflect any kind of understanding of what the example is here. That's a question on the level of saying he's trying to say God is spherical. How stupid is that? Marbles are spherical and he's talking about them. No, we're talking about math and the way that the math helps us to model evidence. When we talk about how the math helps us to model the evidence, we're in a position to evaluate the slogan that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. There's one possible meaning of that slogan, which would be a mistake. This example is an illustration of how the math works, helping people who understand how the math works to see that that is not a true claim. If you mean the slogan that way, you're wrong. I'm counting on this to swell the ranks of those who get the point.
All right. So what's the upshot here of like what's the overall response to this slogan? What is your take on it?
Yeah, the overall response is, if you just mean I need enough evidence to take a claim that is antecedently not very probable and make it rational to believe it, which would mean, in the light of the evidence, it is probable, I have no problem with a slogan if that's all it means. But that's rarely what anyone means who's wielding the slogan. So the very first thing we have to do is to say, look, if this is to be true, here's what it has to mean. However, once you get there, and occasionally you can get there with people, we get this reaction. But any naturalistic explanation must be better than every non-naturalistic explanation. And that's supposed to just close down the discussion. But this is a natural explanation, and we know natural things exist. So there, miracles lose by definition. It's always a bad sign when you try to end any empirical argument by definition. But this is an empirical question, whether miracles occur, whether there's a God. That's a question to be decided on the basis of facts and evidence. The search for a silver bullet is rather misguided and somewhat pathetic, actually. This protest doesn't have anything to do with the evidence. This has to do with that prior probability, right? The idea, oh, but it's terrible to assume that the existence of something that we've never seen, but that there are things that we're all persuaded exist that none of us has ever seen and that none of us ever will see. Almost everybody listening to this live stream right now believes in the existence of atoms. We can't see them. So why do we believe in atoms? We believe in them because their existence explains things that we can see. Nobody can see black holes because, by definition, no light escapes from their surface. So why do we believe that there's a black hole at the heart of our galaxy? Because that explanation accounts for the data that we do have. We've got X-ray streaks. We see stars traveling in tight little spirals down there close to the center of the galaxy. Okay, right. Now we get it. Now we see that we're explaining what we can see by reference to something that we can't. So this idea that naturalistic explanations are just always better than non-natural explanations, that's really a complaint that the existence of God is just too improbable, or the occurrence of a miracle is just too improbable by the very nature of the case. It's another attempt to win the argument just by definition. So I think the showstopper is kind of a hopeless enterprise. So I've got a couple slides where I try to talk about how the logic of the showstopper goes. This is a sincere attempt on my part to reconstruct it. I am trying to steelman something that's generally not run very well, but it's an invalid inference anyway. We're choosing.
Well, to me, it just seems plainly question begging, right? You're just assuming that the evidence can't overcome some initial improbability.
Right, and any finite improbability can, in principle, be overcome by evidence, no matter how low that probability is. And frankly, for the levels of lowness that some people want to set for the existence of God or the occurrence of a miracle, I want an argument, and the argument had better not be Hume's argument, because Hume's argument doesn't work. As many of his own contemporaries and even skeptics like John Stuart Mill and T.H. Huxley agreed, Hume's argument is an overcalling of the case. It doesn't do what he says it does. It's only later that he got resurrected by people like Matthew Arnold and Sir Leslie Stephen, and got sort of brought in as an unquestioned axiom, and also by Trilch and Strauss in the biblical criticism realm. So yeah, it doesn't work, and some of the premises are dubious or false. I'll tease people by flicking these slides across the page quickly, and then I'll just end with a quotation from Thomas Sherlock, writing when Hume was a teenager. I do allow that this case and others of like nature require more evidence to give them credit than ordinary cases do. You may therefore require more evidence in these than other cases, but it is absurd to say that such cases admit no evidence when the things in question, a living man, a dead man, are quite manifestly objects of sense. And with that, I will stop sharing slides, even if there are more slides here, and we'll go back to just being on the video. So let me.
Yeah, I can see you there. So you're up.
Am I back? All right.
Yeah, you're back. You're back for me. All right. So let me ask you one more question, and then for you guys that are watching live, go ahead and start writing down your questions in the live chat for Tim. I'm going to ask him one more question, but as he's answering, I'm going to go through and start collecting your questions and putting them in my little document here so that we can ask him after he finishes this. So here's the question. Here's the last question. Do we need to be able to predict what God would do in order to make an explanatory argument for God's existence?
No, and we know this because we don't do this in scientific cases either. We make explanatory arguments in science where it's not based on a high probability that this piece of evidence would be present if the hypothesis were true. What drives such inferences is always something comparative. It's the explanatory power, if you will, of the hypothesis contrasted with the explanatory power of the falsehood of the hypothesis. The probability of E, supposing that H were true, contrasted with the probability of E, supposing that H were false. Both of those numbers can be low, and yet one of them can be orders of magnitude greater than the other. So I could have the probability of the evidence given that a miracle has occurred be 1 in 100, and the probability of that same evidence given that the miracle hasn't occurred being 1 in a million, and that's a very, very substantial piece of evidence. So the way that this works, you don't have to have a prediction of what you would have if a miracle occurred or what God would do under certain circumstances. This kind of misconception lies behind Gregory Dawes' attack on arguments for the existence of God in his book, Theism and Explanation. It lies behind some of Elliot Sober's work. It's just a misstep from the standpoint of the mathematics. It doesn't work that way. That's not how the probabilities work.
All right, so let's move to questions. David Paulman, and this was actually on Facebook earlier, he said, ask Tim what resources he recommends on the topic of presuppositionalism.
David, I know, and I know why he's asking this. And so the face palm is not about David, but is about the presuppositionalism. I'm against it, and I think my friend Paul Copan has written well and clearly on the issue, and of course it's been savagely attacked by all the presuppositionalists who say no, you don't understand presuppositionalism. I spent quite a lot of time reading Cornelius Van Til's work when I was young, because it was what was handed to me first when I began to ask the question, all right, why should I believe that Christianity is true? And my conclusion from that, and I'm sorry that this is going to offend some people, but my conclusion from that was, if this is the best that Christianity has to offer, Christianity is in trouble. Fortunately, there's a lot of good stuff out there, and so rather than getting involved in the ins and outs of presuppositionalism, if you need to have a one-stop place, go read Stuart Hackett's old book, The Resurrection of Theism, and look at his critique of what he calls voluntaristic rationalism. I think Hackett actually nails it there from a number of different directions. Look at some of John Warwick Montgomery's work, but basically move on from the presuppositionalist stuff and just go and start looking at actual evidence, philosophical arguments, historical arguments. Don't get bogged down with what is, I am persuaded, just a hopeless epistemological framework and bad exegesis of scripture. It's a loss. We can't go there. That's not going to work. We have to do something totally different.
All right, next one is Chad McIntosh. Dear Dr. McGrew, would the normalization of normalizability. Yeah, there we go. Objection to fine-tuning arguments also be an objection to the many infinite worlds hypothesis?
That's going to depend on exactly how an infinite worlds hypothesis is put forward. There are multiverse theories where people try to say these are strictly infinite. I have sat in a room where somebody has said, hey, but that's okay, because if there are infinitely many worlds, then whatever evidence you come up with that God exists, we can just wave our hands toward the infinitely many worlds and then we'll be good. And smart people applauded this. This is a horrible argument. anytime you're introducing infinities to get rid of your probability problems, you're introducing much worse problems. So just to give one example of that, if you go that route with a multiverse with infinitely many worlds, then there are, on the same showing and according to the same premises, infinitely many worlds in which all of our scientific evidence looks just like it does now, except that we're totally wrong about everything. Oh, that wasn't a consequence we wanted to drop out of all of this. So if you don't like that consequence, you should not be invoking infinities as a way of dodging evidence. Man up, face the evidence. You can't get around that way. So whether the normalizability problems arise or not, there are other huge problems with trying to invoke infinities to get away from the evidence.
All right, next question. Holy Terminator. How do you assign values to the evidence? Is it arbitrary?
So that depends entirely on which questions you're looking at and what evidence we in fact have. There are cases where we are not in a strong position to assign probabilities to all the different moving pieces of Bayes' theorem. Sometimes we can't assign them and we need to. And so what we should conclude is, right at the moment, we can't draw any conclusions. Sometimes we're in a pretty good position to do it. So let me give you an example. I don't know how probable it is that I will get an email note from someone with a Croatian name if he exists. I assume not very probable. Most people in Croatia are not emailing me. But I don't have a number for that. And how probable is it that I will get an email from someone of that name if there isn't, in fact, anyone who has that name? It's a Croatian name, but there is no one who actually has that name, and someone is just pranking me and sending me the email. I don't know. I don't have either of those numbers. I'm not even sure how to peg either of those numbers within, I don't know, 2 or 3, 4 orders of magnitude. They're just, I don't know how to give you those numbers. I do know, however, that the ratio of them is very high. And that's what I respond to when I receive the email, and I take this as very strong evidence that there actually is a person of that name. I couldn't have predicted it. I couldn't have calculated the individual numbers, but I've got that inarticulate but reasonable sense of the ratio being quite a mismatch that drives so many of our inferences every day. Every time that you get behind the wheel of a car, you're making thousands of little abductions, as Peirce would call it, like this. And I am persuaded that giving a probabilistic reconstruction is the best way of understanding abduction. So yeah, there are times when we can't put exact numbers on it, and sometimes that paralyzes us, and other times it doesn't. Sometimes we get our probabilities from statistical information. Sometimes we get our probabilities from symmetries. Sometimes we have only approximate probabilities, but they're good enough. Sometimes we're missing one piece, but certain mathematical conditions suffice to isolate the impact of that to the extent that it doesn't really introduce very much uncertainty in our overall calculation. Those are interesting questions. I actually have a problem like that on an exam that I give to my graduate students in the graduate probability seminar, where I have them calculate some upper and lower bounds for some probabilities, despite the fact that there's a missing piece of information. Those are fun cases. But the main point is, we all know that we do make some estimates of some of these things reasonably all the time. So if I were to ask you, Cam, what's the probability that your car will start tomorrow? You would say, I don't have, 12 digits of precision. But what if I just say, name a high probability that you're confident isn't as high as the probability your car will start? You might say, I don't know. What would you say?
I don't know.
Math phobe. Okay, maybe 80%. You think it's more than 80% likely that your car will start?
Yeah.
All right. So there we go. That's pretty high. In fact, I think it's more than 95% likely that my car will start. I'm really confident of that. If you offered me a ticket that pays $1 if my car starts tomorrow, and you offered to sell it to me for 95 cents, I would buy that ticket. and I would collect my extra nickel tomorrow and be very happy. So it's not just that I can make a bet like that and you can judge my probabilities on the basis of the bet. It's also that we all know that rough and ready kinds of estimates like that are readily available, and we make them all the time. So
I think that point is taken. Yeah. Yeah. We make probability judgments like that. And you can also do you can set a lower and upper bound and you can still get all the same kind of stuff, I think.
you get a lot of information out of that.
Yeah, and you can also set conservative figures too, which is what Richard Swinburne does in his book. But all right, let's move on. Ronald Mendonca, he says, if you say you have a dog, I'm good. If you say you have an invisible fire-breathing dragon, you're going to need some extraordinary evidence, right?
Will I need extraordinary evidence in the sense that I will need one spectacular piece of evidence, like I'll bring him and make him melt your computer screen? Or do I just need evidence that is adequate to make it reasonable for you to believe it, which evidence might come in the form of a bunch of different pieces? Now, my claim is that by bringing in pieces of evidence, we can make what is admittedly a much more improbable claim than the claim that I have a dog. We can make it reasonable in principle by supplying sufficient evidence. I am not trying to argue here that that evidence exists. That's a separate argument. The question is just, what can evidence do? And so I'm willing to say, as the quotation from Sherlock indicates, yeah, you can ask for more evidence in this case than in other cases. What you can't do is say it's out of the reach of evidence altogether. That's not cricket.
All right, moving on. Puma Feet asked if you can summarize simply the probability theory stuff. And I mean, you basically just did.
Yeah, I'm trying to do this in terms of examples. And I've also tried to do it in terms of the math, but I understand not everybody wants to follow the math. In the end, there's nothing like the math for understanding math. That's just the way that it works. But, if you ask me, can you explain differential calculus simply? I can give you some overarching concepts, and I can tell you some things you can and can't do, but then you need to just take a course. So I'm trying here to give the bottom line on extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence is, if by that you just mean improbable claims require evidence sufficient to make them probable if they're to be probable, I'm totally on board with that. If you mean you've got to make your, what's the, was it the Godspell musical, right? Jesus Christ, if you're no fool, come walk across my swimming pool. Yeah, you can always demand evidence of a kind you don't have. The question is whether the evidence you do have is sufficient. That's all.
So Raj McWan, he asked, how do you address the argument from prior probability for resurrection? I guess I'm guessing he's saying, how do you address the argument that it's improbable? The prior is really low.
So I think the resurrection of any randomly selected individual, qua randomly selected individual, is low. I'm happy to say that that's low. But so is the claim that any randomly selected individual will win next year's lottery. Evidence takes us from low probability to high probability with regard to specific individuals. It could, in principle, do so with a resurrection. Does the evidence, in fact, exist? What does that look like? Does it do the job? Those are questions that are not within the scope of just analyzing a slogan here. And those are questions that Lydia and I have tried to put out an answer to in our contribution to the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology. And you can find a draft of that on Lydia's website, lydiamcgrew.com. I'll send you a link to that, Cameron, and you can put that up.
Yeah, I don't know why I didn't put that in there. All right, let's move on to another question from Sergeant Slaughter. What atheist books would you recommend reading? The ones that make the strongest case against God?
Oh, yeah. So my favorite, just for its combination of readability and philosophical acumen, is still J.L. Mackey's book, The Miracle of Theism. I think Mackey...
When was that published, by the way? Was it in the 80s?
It's the 80s, and it's a response in large measure to some of Richard Swinburne's work on the existence of God. And then Swinburne's got an updated version of his book, The Existence of God, in which he engages more with Mackey as well. But I'd say Mackey's book is really good in that way. If you want very technical material, then you probably want to go with
The Logic of Theism.
Jordan Howard Sobel, Logic and Theism. or Graham Oppie arguing about gods, but Sobel will engage more with the probability theory, whereas Oppie is more interested in deductive arguments, pro and con. So those two are really good books to look at in that respect if you want to get sort of some very intelligent atheists putting forward their case. Graham Oppie and I also have some exchanges in the book, Four Views on Christianity and Philosophy. We were two of the contributors. So each of us writes a target essay of about the same length. Each of us writes a response to the other's essay, and each of us responds to the response. So it's a very even-handed format, and you get to see us going back and forth there, and I would recommend that exchange. Extracted from the volume is like a self-contained set of interactions between Graham and me, and you might find that interesting. There are plenty of older works, I would say, with regard to the Gospels. Probably the most significant body of work that's been put forward as an attack on the historical credibility of the Gospels in modern times is Bart Ehrman's work. And he's got several works misquoting Jesus, Jesus Interrupted, and so forth. And I would say I have many, many disagreements with Bart, but it's one-stop shopping if you want to see a bunch of objections all put in the same place. There are other books by atheists, and I'm sure everybody would be mad that I didn't name your favorite one. I don't think The God Delusion is a good choice because I think the quality of argument is very low, and I think that even sensible atheists would agree with me that by comparison with books by Mackey or Oppie or Sobel, Dawkins just isn't even he's not playing in the same league.
Yeah, Michael Roos has even gone on record saying that it was an embarrassment, basically. Like that was his actual statement. All right, Adam does SE, which SE stands for Street Epistemology, Capturing Christianity. Question: how many people have been resurrected in all of history according to Tim? That's part one. Part two is, what's the probability at least one person will be resurrected in the next 2,000 years?
So, I mean, we've got 3 or 4 examples recorded in the Gospels, right? We've got the son of the widow of Nain, we've got Lazarus, we've got Jesus. I think the number has been very small, and I think that such events aren't scattered through history because that's not something that God wanted to do. As far as how many people will be resurrected in the next 2,000 years, I don't know. It depends on, I suppose, if you take a certain interpretation of the book of Revelation, you might say, well, at least 2. If you don't take that interpretation, you would say maybe 0. I don't know. I don't think it's an everyday occurrence. You're dealing here with an act by a being who has a will and purposes. You're not dealing with some kind of esoteric change in the melting point of copper or something else like a natural law changing. If a natural law were somehow to shift, then we would expect all new samples of copper would melt at the new temperature. But when a rational being decides to do something that would not have happened unless he had done it, he doesn't always repeat himself. How many times will I marry someone named Lydia? I've done it once. I'm not anticipating it will ever happen again. Rational beings choose to do certain things and then under other circumstances choose not to. That's just life with this. So yeah, I wouldn't put the probability personally very high, but it doesn't need to be in order for the resurrection to be something that could be made rational to believe by sufficient evidence. That's the only point I'm trying to make here.
So next one is from Eric Manning. What do you say to skeptics who say that we can't know that God raised Jesus, but it could be a host of other supernatural explanations like Satan, Baal, or Vishnu?
Yeah, it could, right? Possibility is cheap. And it could be that the low rumbling noise that I hear in the distance is not a thunderstorm approaching, but is gremlins bowling on the far side of my house in the attic where they've set up a bowling alley. That doesn't mean that the supposition merits equal time. There are things less probable than God's raising Jesus from the dead. And some of those explanations, like aliens. I mean, I love this, really. I mean, this is a gift. Thank you, internet atheists, for reminding us that frequently enough, your response to the evidence for the resurrection is aliens. Really? I mean, come on. So, yeah, in response to Eric's question, I would say, yeah, it could be. But now you're going to have to explain to me why aliens or Baal would have constructed a national literature of the kind that the Jewish national literature is, all of which would point to the coming of a Messiah. Why Isaiah 53 would have been written, I don't really care for this purpose when you date Isaiah. You can date Isaiah 53 which is in the second part of it, you can date that to the 5th century or the 3rd century or the 2nd century. Either way, it's centuries before Jesus. You got to grapple with that. So, and none of these other explanations does any justice to that. And, why would Zeus have, if Zeus existed, have wanted to raise Jesus of Nazareth from the dead in a way that would give people reason to think it had been done by Yahweh? Poser, don't think there's a good answer to that question.
All right, we have 3 more questions. Actually, only 2.
Just keep going. It's fine.
So, okay, just 3 more. The second one is actually not even a question. It's just a statement that I want to get your response to. But this one is from Brett Lunn. He asks, what is your favorite book of the Bible?
I really like the Gospel of John, and I think it gets a bum rap in contemporary scholarship. I think that it is actually an intimate portrait by somebody who knew Jesus personally and is not indulging in a bunch of literary reconfiguration. I think it's written by somebody who saw what was happening and is trying to report it as he saw it. I'm not saying he has no theological reflections, and there are interesting questions like, why is it that Jesus and John sound so much alike at various places? I think there are good answers to those questions, but I would say the Gospel of John's right up there for me.
Nice. Okay, this one is from Kevin Wright. He says, bottom line is McGrew and CC, that's me, have a book. Like the Muslim has his book and the Hindu has his book, etc., etc. You have a book, Cameron, and it's all you will ever have.
Is this an argument? Was there an argument here somewhere? Is the argument, if you're using a book as the evidence to establish, or I should say the multiple documents collected together in a book as the evidence to establish a claim, then your claim can't be rational? Because that's really silly. There's all kinds of things that we establish on the basis of historical testimony, even the historical testimony of only one individual. A lot of things that Josephus tells us, we have only Josephus. Tacitus Germanica is our only source for a lot of the information about German tribes in the Roman Empire. We don't say, well, then he must not know what he's talking about. We consider it to be actually quite good evidence. Plus the fact that there are interlockings, undesigned coincidences, and other kinds of internal evidences that the various authors who wrote various parts of Scripture are actually well-informed and habitually truthful. Yeah, this is, I don't know, this is meme level attacks that it just doesn't even make contact with the evidence. We need to get beyond this, guys.
Okay, so I lied. Maybe we're going to have 2 more. This one is from the Canadian Atheist. We met him earlier. He says, question in all caps. Can you produce one, that's another capital, piece of objectively verifiable evidence?
For a miracle? Is that? Look, we can, if by objectively verifiable, we build enough conditions into it that we know it can't be satisfied, well, then you can say no. But if you take a normal sense of objectively verifiable, yeah, I've got objectively verifiable testimony of people close to the facts who had nothing visible to gain by saying that these things happened, who said that these things happened and actually suffered labors and dangers and various sufferings on account of these accounts that they delivered, and as far as we can tell, solely because they believe the accounts to be true. That is objectively verifiable. That is a matter of virtually incontestable historical fact. It doesn't even depend on there being the persons who are named as the authors of the Gospels. But that much is absolutely, you'd really have to be out there in la la land, out there, hobnobbing with the people who say Jesus never existed and other tinfoil hat kinds of things in order to deny that. And you may not like it, you may not think that evidence is sufficient, but yes, that is objective, it's verifiable, and it increases the probability of the hypothesis, so it is evidence. There you go.
So actually, I'm waiting. I asked for clarification on this guy's question, but I wanted to ask you, like, I've read your article that you co-authored with Lydia, and you arrive at a figure for the Bayes factor that's, I think it was 10 to the 44th power.
It's like 10 to the 43rd or something like that. It's right up there, yeah.
Okay, and so one of the points that you make is that, like, that Bayes factor, maybe you can explain real quickly what that is. But one of the points you make is that the Bayes factor, if we actually look at the evidence, the Bayes factor is so high that even if the prior probability is low, like it'd have to be lower than that. It'd have to be way lower than 10 to the negative,
Right.
40th or whatever. So talk about that a little bit. How did you arrive at that figure? What is the Bayes factor?
Yeah, the Bayes factor is just a ratio of the expectedness of the evidence supposing that the hypothesis is true and the expectedness of the evidence supposing that it's false. And the reason that it has such a colossal value is that the denominator of that is just screamingly low. Now, we argue for that, and we argue by putting in some illustrative numbers. Maybe you don't like our numbers. Fine. Show me the numbers that you would put in, and let's have a discussion of it, right? The illustrative numbers are there to show how the probability works. We don't think they're unreasonable numbers, but if you disagree, we can have a discussion about that. That's fine. That's not a problem. You don't like the degree of the mismatch, you may try to say, okay, but you're assuming independence. Well, we have a whole discussion of why we're doing the calculation under independence and which way it probably breaks if the independence breaks down, because independence can go either favorable or unfavorable. But it's basically a mismatch in how well the resurrections actually happening would explain the evidence we have versus it's not happening and how well that would explain it. Maybe one way to put this that we'll get through even without the math is, what's the most likely thing to have happened if Jesus didn't rise from the dead? And the answer is nothing. His followers go back to fishing, the Jesus movement collapses, and there's an end to it. That's what happened in the 2nd century when Bar Kokhba led a rebellion, and that collapsed, and he got holed up in a hill in Samaria and died in a cave somewhere. He didn't even get crucified, and the whole movement just collapsed. People didn't even want to admit that they'd known who he was. So, yeah, that's what the Bayes factor is. It's just that ratio that I was talking about in the math parts of the slides earlier. And we can talk about the specific numbers, but I think any way you slice it, the numbers are going to come up that there's a very significant mismatch there. And that's what drives the argument. It's that mismatch, that disproportion that does the epistemic heavy lifting.
So if you're not watching this live, check for the link in the description. I've linked to his paper, so you can just go read it for yourself, like read through the whole thing. Not just his paper, but him and Lydia. But all right, so I've asked for clarity on this question that I was going to ask actually way earlier on. It didn't make a lot of sense, but here it is now. His name is Utopia Buster, 2017. He says, isn't the evidence for supernatural events or phenomenon first-person specific?
Only in the trivial sense that all evidence is first-person specific, right? I mean,
yeah, that was exactly my first thought as well.
My only evidence that he's asking this question is that I'm having the experiences of hearing you relay something that sounds like you're relaying somebody's questions. But in the sense of, is it like all a dream, a vision that no one else can see? No. We can all look at this testimony that we have recorded. We can all look at the interlockings of that with non-Christian sources. We can look at the undesigned coincidences. We can look at the embarrassing details. We can look at the unexplained allusions. Lydia's got an article online that explains why that's a kind of evidence all on its own. We can look at the reconcilable variations and ask ourselves how likely it is that people who were just randomly adding stuff and making it up would produce accounts that actually dovetail, even though they don't seem to at first. That's really a remarkable body of evidence, and we have to take that seriously, look at it, and engage with it. So yeah, that's, what else can I say? Look at the evidence, people. This is not about faith in your heart in some sense that circumvents the evidence. This is about evidence. And if you have faith, it should be faith because you have evidence. Faith just being trust. What do you do when you have good evidence? You trust it. That faith is a response. It's not a substitute for evidence.
All right, so I'm just going to get your thoughts on one last comment, and then we're going to close it out. I promise. Sure. Adam does SE. This guy's a street epistemologist, apparently. He has a quote here. He's trying to do sort of a reductio on what you said earlier. He says, quote, if Muhammad didn't fly on a winged horse, the whole thing would have collapsed and no one would know what Islam is.
Nobody saw Muhammad fly on the winged horse. Okay, this is not something that was supposed to be a publicly viewed event. There's no historical testimony of anybody having done this. That's just not true. Besides which, Islam flourished when it finally got off the ground after 10 years of languishing. It flourished at the point of a sword. And so did Christianity, but the difference is the direction that sword was pointing. So just no parallel here at all. And anybody who thinks there is needs to go back and reread the Quran.
All right. Well, thanks, Tim, for coming on. This was an awesome interview. One of the things that sparked this, and the reason why I wanted to have you on, is because I think that your view on this slogan is the best I've ever seen. And it goes back to this lecture that you gave at this probability workshop. Would you mind taking just a 30 seconds and talking about that workshop? And I'll link to it again in the description. But because there was a lot of great resources there from Callum Miller, from David Glass, from John DePoe even had a really interesting lecture on skeptical theism.
Right. So several of us were at a conference at Oxford University, and we set up this workshop for people who were kind of into the probability stuff. They wanted the probability geeks, right? We set up this workshop, and people came to that and then could engage. And so we had an audience of people who were a little better prepared to run with some of the difficult stuff than your average even philosophy conference audience. And Richard Swinburne was in attendance, and so we had some real fun with that. So that was something Callum set up, and he did an initial presentation, which I thought was just brilliantly clear. And then, as you say, John DePoe and David Glass made presentations. I thought it was a very successful workshop and advanced the discussion, which not all conferences and all workshops and all papers actually do. But I was very, very impressed with the quality of the interactions that we got and of the papers that other people presented.
Awesome. Yeah. And so that's what, like I said, that's what sort of sparked this, is that your response to this, basically breaking down what that slogan means probabilistically, what it can mean, and then how it doesn't actually challenge the resurrection at all. Because really, it just goes back to the evidence. You got to look at the evidence and see whether or not you got to analyze it. You know, how strong is the evidence, and get that Bayes factor, and then put all the stuff in it. You can't make claims about the prior probability being so low that no evidence can overcome it without doing the work of looking at how strong the evidence is and making an argument for that. You can't just assert that the evidence isn't good.
And you also have to make an argument that the prior probability is inaccessibly low if you're going to say it's inaccessible. And this is something, I mean, check out Jordan Howard Sobel in his book Logic and Theism. He actually claims that he's got to go outside of standard analysis and use non-standard analysis and infinitesimals to try to make something like Hume's argument work. This is a bad sign. When you're that desperate, things are going wrong. But if somebody wants to go and check out what Sobel has to say there, not to be confused with Elliot Sober, that's a different person. This is Jordan Howard Sobel, the late Howard Sobel, who died a few years back. But his book does remain a good place to go for a technical exposition of atheism. And so anyway.
All right, Tim, thanks for coming on. And if you guys want to learn more about what we're doing, make sure to head over to facebook.com/capturing Christianity. You can follow our Facebook page. We're also on Twitter, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet. We have a bunch of stuff planned. I mean, we release these little videos every now and then, these little short clips. The one on the question of whether, what is the question again? Why didn't God just create everyone in heaven? Is the question that I answer in a short video that's going to be coming out next week on our YouTube channel. So make sure to subscribe, turn on notifications so you can be alerted exactly when things go live and these new little videos that pop up. So yeah, anyways, so thanks again, Tim, for coming on. It's always a pleasure. And yeah, anything else that you wanted to leave with the audience with?
If there are good, intelligent questions that maybe were left in the chat after you stopped reading them, or that somebody brings up on your Facebook page, let me know. Always happy to interact with intelligent questions from any side. If they're intelligent and polite, we're good.
Awesome. All right, guys. Well, have a good night, and we'll see you later. All right. Peace.